They don't feel it when you feel it. That's the part that confuses people the most. When the connection starts breaking, when communication becomes strained, when you're sitting there trying to understand what changed, they've already started creating distance internally. Not because they're heartless, but because their instinct is to regulate discomfort by detaching from it. So while you're leaning in, trying to repair, trying to have conversations, trying to make sense of the shift, they're already numbing out. And that's why the realization is delayed. An avoidant doesn't process loss in the moment it happens. They override it. They intellectualize it. They tell themselves a story that justifies their withdrawal. This is too much. I need space. This isn't right for me. And in that moment, those thoughts feel true to them because they're driven by a nervous system that equates closeness with pressure. So walking away doesn't feel like destruction. It feels like relief. But relief is not resolution. Relief is temporary. It's what happens when you remove the stimulus, not when you understand it. And eventually, the distractions they used to maintain that relief begin to fade. The busy routines, the surface-level conversations, the emotional avoidance set all starts to lose its effectiveness. Because underneath all of that, there's something unresolved waiting to be acknowledged. And this is where the shift begins. It doesn't happen dramatically at first. It's subtle. It's a thought that lingers a little longer than usual. A memory that doesn't fade as quickly. A quiet moment where they're not occupied and suddenly your absence feels different. Not like freedom, but like something missing. And they don't immediately label it as loss because that would require them to confront what they did. So instead, they sit in this undefined discomfort. But the mind doesn't leave things undefined forever. Over time, those small moments begin to connect. The silence becomes louder. The absence becomes more specific. And what they once dismissed as needing space starts to feel like something they can't quite replace. That's when the realization begins to take shape, not all at once, but piece by piece. They start to see that what they walked away from wasn't just intensity or expectation. It was consistency. It was emotional presence. It was someone who was willing to stay and work through discomfort instead of escaping it. And that recognition is unsettling because it challenges the narrative they used to justify leaving. Now they're faced with a contradiction. If the relationship wasn't the problem, then what was? And that question is uncomfortable because it turns the focus inward. This is where the delay becomes significant. Because by the time they start asking that question, by the time they begin to see things more clearly, you are no longer in the same place. You've already gone through the pain they avoided. You've already sat with the confusion, the hurt, the silence. You've already started making sense of it, rebuilding yourself, finding clarity in what happened. So while their realization is just beginning, your healing is already in motion, and that timing difference matters. Because when the realization finally lands, when it's no longer abstract, when it's no longer something they can push away, it doesn't come gently. It comes with weight. It comes with the understanding that what they left behind wasn't easily replaceable, that what they dismissed wasn't insignificant, that what they avoided had real consequences. And here's the part people don't always talk about. Realization doesn't automatically lead to action. Just because they see it now doesn't mean they know what to do with it. In fact, for many avoidants, awareness creates a different kind of discomfort, the kind that exposes their own patterns without immediately giving them the tools to change them. So they sit in this space between understanding and inaction, where they recognize the loss but still struggle to engage with it directly. And that's why, from the outside, it can look like nothing has changed. But internally, something has shifted. The narrative they once relied on no longer holds the same certainty. The distance they created no longer feels as justified. And the connection they walked away from starts to carry a different meaning, one that they didn't allow themselves to see before. By the time they fully grasp it, the realization is no longer about the relationship alone. It's about themselves, their patterns, their defenses, the ways they've protected themselves at the cost of something real. And that's not an easy realization to sit with, because it forces them to confront a truth they've been avoiding all along. It wasn't just about what they felt, it was about what they couldn't face. And by the time they finally do, the silence they once chose becomes the very thing they have to live with. And once that realization begins to settle in, once the initial shock of maybe I misjudged this takes hold, something else starts happening beneath the surface. They begin revisiting the past, but not in the way they did before. Earlier, their memories were selective, filtered through self-protection. They remembered the pressure, the discomfort, the moments that justified distance. But now, the lens changes. It's no longer about defending their decision. It becomes about understanding it, and that's when the rewriting begins. Not consciously at first. It's subtle, almost involuntary. A moment crosses their mind, something small, something they once dismissed. Maybe it's the way you listened without interrupting, or how you stayed calm when they pulled away, or the patience you showed when things didn't make sense. These weren't the moments they focused on before. In fact, these were the moments they overlooked, because acknowledging them would have made leaving more complicated. But now, those same moments carry weight. They start to see that what they labeled as too much wasn't actually excess, it was consistency. What they framed as emotional intensity wasn't instability, it was depth. And that distinction matters because it destabilizes the story they told themselves when they walked away. You have to understand, avoidant patterns rely heavily on narrative control. It's how they maintain distance without feeling like they're losing something valuable. If they can convince themselves that the relationship was overwhelming, flawed, or unsustainable, then leaving feels logical. It feels necessary. It feels like self-preservation. But when the narrative begins to crack, the logic no longer holds. Now they're not just remembering what went wrong, they're remembering what went right. And more importantly, they're recognizing what they failed to see at the time. The emotional availability they once resisted now appears rare. The effort they once minimized now appears significant. And the person they distance themselves from you starts to look very different in retrospect. This is where the internal conflict intensifies. Because rewriting the past isn't just about seeing things more clearly, it's about confronting the implications of that clarity. If you are not the problem they believed you to be, then their reaction to you becomes the focus. Their withdrawal, their silence, their inability to engage those things can no longer be explained away as reasonable responses to a flawed situation. They have to consider the possibility that the issue wasn't the relationship itself, but their capacity to be in it. And that's not an easy conclusion to arrive at. So what happens instead is a kind of psychological tension between two versions of the past. The old version, where leaving made sense, and the emerging version, where staying might have required growth they weren't ready for. They move back and forth between these perspectives, trying to reconcile them, trying to find a version of the story that doesn't place too much responsibility on them. But the more they revisit it, the harder it becomes to ignore certain truths. They start noticing patterns not just in that relationship, but across others. Similar endings, similar reasons, similar emotional exits. And suddenly, it's not just about you anymore. You become part of a larger pattern they can't easily dismiss. And that recognition adds another layer to the rewriting process, because now it's not just about what they lost, it's about how they lose. And that's where the depth of the realization really begins to take shape. They may not articulate it clearly. They may not come forward and say, "I see everything differently now." But internally, the shift is happening. The memories are no longer one-dimensional. They're layered, complex, and often uncomfortable. They carry both appreciation and regret, understanding and confusion. And perhaps most significantly, they begin to feel something they avoided before: accountability. Not in a dramatic outward sense, but in a quiet, persistent awareness that they misinterpreted something meaningful, that they responded to connection as if it were a threat, that they walked away from something that required presence, not distance. And this awareness doesn't immediately resolve anything. In fact, it often creates more questions than answers. What would have happened if they stayed? Could they have handled it differently? Was the outcome inevitable, or was it shaped by their own limitations? These are not easy questions, and avoidant individuals are not naturally inclined to sit with them. But once the rewriting begins, those questions don't disappear. They linger. And over time, they reshape how the entire experience is understood. What was once dismissed as just another relationship becomes something more significant. Not necessarily because it was perfect, but because it exposed something real, something they weren't equipped to handle at the time. And that realization carries a different kind of weight than simple nostalgia. It's not just missing you. It's understanding you too late. And that's where the real shift lies. Because when someone begins to see the past with clarity instead of defense, they're no longer protected by the story they told themselves. They're left with the truth of what was and the awareness of what they did with it. And sometimes that awareness is more difficult to carry than the loss itself, because loss can be externalized. It can be blamed on timing, circumstances, incompatibility. But clarity removes those buffers. It brings the focus inward, where the answers are less convenient and far more personal. And by the time they fully grasp that, by the time the past has been rewritten with honesty instead of avoidance, they are no longer just looking back at what happened. They're looking at who they were when it happened. And that realization doesn't ask for comfort, it demands recognition. And as that clarity deepens once the past is no longer protected by distortion and the narrative has been stripped of its convenient explanation, something far more difficult begins to surface. Not memory this time, not reinterpretation, but consequence, emotional consequence, the kind that cannot be reasoned away or reframed to feel comfortable. This is where guilt enters the picture. Not the performative kind, not the kind that seeks immediate release through apology or explanation, but a quieter, more persistent form. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in the background of their thoughts. Because at this stage, they're no longer just revisiting what happened, they're beginning to understand the impact of what they did. And that distinction matters. Understanding events is one thing. Understanding impact is something else entirely. It requires empathy, and empathy requires proximity to emotions they've spent a long time avoiding. So when that awareness begins to form, it doesn't feel natural. It feels intrusive. It disrupts the internal balance they've relied on to maintain distance from discomfort. They start to recognize specific moments, not just what was said or done, but how it must have felt on the receiving end. The silence that once felt like control now looks like abandonment. The withdrawal that felt like self-protection now appears as emotional neglect. And those realizations are not easy to hold, because they shift the perspective from "I did what I needed to do" to "someone was affected by what I chose to do." And once that shift happens, it cannot easily be undone. This is why avoidants often struggle at this stage, because guilt requires ownership, and ownership challenges the very mechanisms they've used to cope. Their instinct is still to create distance, to minimize, to rationalize. But those strategies don't work the same way anymore, because the clarity they've gained has already weakened them. So what you see from the outside might still look like silence, still look like detachment, still look like nothing has changed. But internally, there's friction. They begin to feel a kind of dissonance between how they see themselves and what they now recognize in their behavior. Most avoidants don't perceive themselves as intentionally harmful. In fact, many see themselves as independent, self-sufficient, even considerate in their own way. But now they're confronted with evidence that contradicts that self-image, and that creates tension. Because if they are not the person who hurts others, then how do they explain what happened? And if they are capable of causing that kind of impact, then what does that say about how they relate to people? These are not comfortable questions, and they don't lead to immediate clarity. Instead, they often lead to avoidance of a different kind, not avoidance of you, but avoidance of their own internal reckoning. They may distract themselves, shift focus, immerse in routine or new connections. But the difference now is that the awareness doesn't disappear, it follows them. In quieter moments, in transitions, in the absence of noise, it returns, not as a clear narrative, but as a feeling, a subtle weight, a sense that something unresolved remains. And over time, that feeling becomes harder to ignore because it's no longer tied to a specific situation. It becomes part of their broader emotional landscape. They might not express it directly. They might not reach out, might not articulate regret in a way that provides closure. But that doesn't mean the guilt isn't present. It simply means they haven't fully integrated it, and integration is the difficult part. Because to integrate guilt, they have to move beyond recognition into responsibility. They have to accept that their patterns have consequences not just for themselves, but for others. And that acceptance requires a level of emotional engagement that goes against their default wiring. So instead, they often sit in a kind of unresolved awareness. They know enough to feel the weight of it, but not enough or not yet ready enough to transform that awareness into change. And this is where people often misunderstand the situation. They assume that if someone feels guilty, they will act on it. That guilt naturally leads to apology, to repair, to some form of external acknowledgement. But for avoidance, the process is not that linear. Guilt doesn't immediately translate into action. It often intensifies the very behaviors that created the distance in the first place. Because facing you would mean facing themselves. And if they're not prepared to do that, they remain where they are, aware but inactive, aware but still disconnected from the full expression of that awareness. But even in that state, something has changed. They can no longer return to the version of themselves that was untouched by this experience. The clarity they've gained, the understanding of impact, the recognition of their own patterns. It all becomes part of how they see themselves moving forward. Whether they act on it or not, it reshapes their internal world, and that's the paradox of it. The very thing they tried to avoid, emotional responsibility, becomes something they carry quietly, persistently. Not because someone forced it onto them, but because once seen, it cannot be unseen. And that weight doesn't always lead to reconciliation. It doesn't always result in repair. But it does leave a mark, a deeper awareness of how their distance affects others, and how their choices echo beyond the moment they're made. So when we talk about guilt in this context, we're not talking about punishment. We're talking about recognition, the kind that doesn't seek to hurt, but inevitably does. The kind that doesn't ask for attention, but remains present. Because in the end, the hardest thing for an avoidant is not losing someone. It's realizing they were the reason the connection couldn't survive and having to live with that understanding. And then something shifts that they didn't anticipate, something that doesn't come from memory or analysis, but from lived experience in the present. Your absence stops being theoretical. It becomes real. Because there's a difference between creating distance and experiencing loss. Distance is controlled. It's intentional. It gives them a sense of autonomy, a sense that they are managing their emotional environment. But loss is different. Loss is not something they orchestrate, it's something they encounter. And when you finally step back, when you stop reaching, stop explaining, stop holding space for someone who could not hold it for you, that's when the dynamic changes in a way they didn't prepare for. At first, they may interpret your absence the same way they interpret their own distance. They assume it's temporary. They assume you'll return, that the connection still exists in the same form, just paused. Because in their experience, emotional space has always been reversible. They pull away, and eventually things settle. The connection resumes, often without fully addressing what caused the rupture in the first place. But this time, something is different. This time, your absence has weight. It has finality, not necessarily in a dramatic or declared way, but in a quiet, consistent withdrawal of your presence. You're no longer there in the same capacity. The energy has shifted, and that's when they begin to feel something unfamiliar. Not pressure, not overwhelm, emptiness. And emptiness is difficult for them to process because it doesn't give them anything to push against. There's no conflict to justify their distance, no emotional intensity to regulate, just space. And in that space, they begin to notice what is no longer there: your consistency, your responsiveness, the way you anticipated their needs without demanding the same in return. The emotional steadiness that once felt excessive now reveals itself as something grounding. And without it, their environment feels different, less connected, less meaningful. This is where the realization becomes embodied. It's no longer just a thought, maybe I lost something valuable. It becomes a lived experience of that loss. They begin to encounter situations where your presence would have mattered, conversations that feel shallow in comparison, interactions that lack the depth they once resisted. And slowly they start to understand that what they walked away from wasn't easily replaceable. Because connection is not interchangeable. You can meet new people, you can form new interactions, but the specific dynamic, the particular way someone understands you, the emotional language that develops over time that cannot simply be recreated on demand. And this is something avoidants often don't fully grasp until they're faced with its absence. So they start comparing, not intentionally, not always consciously, but inevitably. And in those comparisons, something becomes clear. What they had with you carried a kind of depth they didn't fully recognize at the time. And that realization doesn't feel empowering. It feels disorienting. Because it challenges the assumption that they can always find something equivalent without having to engage at the same level. It confronts the idea that connection can be maintained without vulnerability. And it exposes a gap between what they thought they needed and what actually gave their life meaning. At this stage, longing begins to take shape, but it's not always expressed in direct ways. Avoidants don't typically move toward longing with openness. Instead, it shows up indirectly, in restlessness, in dissatisfaction with things that should feel sufficient.